Good evening, everyone. I'm Vicky Hayward, and I'm Chairman of the RSA, and I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to our inaugural lecture. Just before we begin, could I ask you to make sure that your mobile phones are switched to silent, or preferably turned off altogether, so they don't sort of hum away in your pocket. We are live streaming this event this evening, so welcome to those of you that are watching us on the website. And a reminder that the hashtag is hashtag RSA Chairman if you wish to tweet and get involved in the discussion that way. Now, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Sir Martin Davidson this evening as Chief Executive of the British Council. He was knighted for his services to British cultural, scientific and educational interests worldwide in the 2014 New Year's Honours. Martin's commitment to international relationships have been a constant feature of his career since, as a young English graduate, he went first to Hong Kong as an administrative officer. When he joined the British Council as assistant representative in Beijing in 1984, the British Council operation in China was just 6 people working in a converted bicycle shed in the British Embassy. And in those days, how life has moved on, it was illegal for a Chinese national to speak to a foreigner. Martin played a pivotal part in building this fledgling presence up to its present strength of now more than 230 people in 4 state-of-the-art offices, and I'm pretty sure we can now say they're very actively in discussion with as many Chinese nationals as they possibly could be. Martin's held various posts in the British Council, Geographical Directorate, with responsibilities that have included South East Europe in a particularly troubled time in that region's history, the Middle East, East Asia and the Americas. In his lecture this evening, Martin will reflect on the transformed global environment we currently find ourselves in and consider whether creativity, the cultivation and sharing of the power to create that lies in all of us, offers the UK a way-ahead amidst the race for global relevance. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sir Martin Davidson. Thank you very much.
Vicky, thank you very much indeed. And could I start by saying what a huge pleasure it is to be able to speak to you this evening. A distinguished audience in a marvellous location. And even better, just a short walk away from the British Council, though inevitably that meant I was later than I should have been. The RSA has a reputation as a provocateur of many of the conversations about the things that really matter in this country, and indeed beyond our borders. And I'm particularly pleased to have been invited to give the Chairman's lecture on the subject that is linked, loosely, and with a great free rein, naturally, to the RSA's overarching theme of creativity. Creativity is, I believe, part of the human condition. There are, of course, differences in terms of opportunities, whether through the genetic lottery of talent or of access to education, skills and opportunities. But creativity has nonetheless been around since the beginning of human experience. And just as we have the power to create as individuals, it is the act of sharing this creativity, the exchange of cultural artifacts, ideas and ways of doing things, that has been a powerful golden thread that runs through human history. The power to create is not only a capacity for individuals, it is dependent upon connections between them, on the sharing of the creativity that they generate. And it is this sharing of creativity that I would like to focus on, because I believe that as well as the noble drive of the RSA to embed creativity in all human activity, as enabling us to lead richer lives, it is through the sharing of creativity that we can deliver benefits at the human, national and international level. I will argue that for the UK in particular, our creativity and this use of our creative assets is critical to our remaining relevant in the world. Now, sharing creativity has an immensely long history. It can come from a variety of motives, more or less noble: to gain influence, as a key medium of exchange of value, a means of building ideas, to display ingenuity, talent or power, to curry favour, or simply to share what we have, think or create as an expression of who we are. Human communities have already done this. Around 28,000 BC, as humans made their way across Europe, Venus figurines statuettes depicting the female form exchanged hands from group to group and travelled far. Although we probably don't know the cultural significance now, their significance was undoubtedly cultural and carried with it powerful messages of identity, belief, a sense of place in the world, relationships to other groups, as well as a display of technical prowess or economic resources needed in their production. Knowledge and ideas have been exchanged more systematically through the institutions such as the Great Library at Alexandria and the great medieval universities, as well as in the courts of the powerful. There were places where ideas met, ideas creating the powerful exponential ratchet effect that has only increased in recent times. And states have always shared their cultural assets and artefacts, whether for power, display, or the open search for the innovative, the creative, to help drive and stimulate their own knowledge or prosperity. When Zheng He sailed from China in the early 15th century in command of a huge armada to establish a Chinese presence far afield, as far as Eastern Africa, and impress other countries, his holds were filled with gifts such as porcelain and silk to dispense as he went along. And in return, he received novelties such as a giraffe. And as he went amongst strangers, the interactions which eased and cemented this exchange of items that perhaps impressed, excited wonder, or even worried the other, but which certainly created connections and told something about each side. But more of the story of Zheng He later. This cultural creative exchange has continued even through the tumultuous changes of the past 80 years. The British Council was founded in 1934 in response to concern that the fascist regimes in Europe were telling a better story than we were, and the express purpose of developing closer cultural relations between the UK and other countries. In 1941, when scenes like the one above were common in our streets, a predecessor of mine wrote in our annual report, "The constant interchange of knowledge, ideas and discoveries was always the life of Europe in its wiser days. It is rightly now no less the life of the world. Neighbourliness, as it may be called, has spread in widening circles since the day when a man in the next country was a foreigner, until our neighbours are in the Americas and the China Seas no less than in Western Europe. To foster that interchange in the interests of a peaceful and happy international relationship is rightly to be regarded as a function of the prudent state." They certainly wrote better in those days, or at least less bureaucratically. In the 80 years of British Council's life, we've moved through a succession of turbulent ages. But this exchange has never really broken down, even though at times it was constrained by walls. Even during the Cold War, academic and professional exchanges and visits and the exchange of theatrical and musical performances continued. For example, a tour by the Old Vic to Moscow in 1961, just before the world went to the precipice of nuclear war. A confidential note sent by the British Embassy to one of my predecessors about that tour said, "The visit has been an unqualified success," they always are. "The company have played day after day, matinees as well as evening performances to packed houses. The reception received from the audience was invariably enthusiastic, and the number of curtain calls was usually between 6 and 12, a very high score indeed for Moscow." I love the idea of somebody sitting there and actually counting the curtain calls. "The tour aroused enormous interest among the theatrical and film people. I have been told the Russians are revising their whole concept of Macbeth after seeing the Old Vic performance." Again, I love the idea of, I'm not quite sure what the Russians' concept of Macbeth was in 1961, but it obviously was interesting. But the ambassador goes on to say, "Official Moscow has also shown unusual interest. Kuznetsov, the acting Minister for Foreign Affairs, told me he had seen all 3 plays and was full of obviously genuine praise. Kenneth James was told by the director of the filial that Mikoyan, who is not particularly well disposed towards the British, saw all 3 plays. Mrs. Khrushchev went 5 or 6 times, and as you will have seen from the newspapers, Khrushchev himself, Mikoyan and Fursetsa, the Minister of Culture, all attended last night's performance of The Importance of Being Earnest." Now that was written in January 1961. Unfortunately, it didn't stop the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it is interesting to see the ripple of creative impact on the Moscow theatrical world. And that really is the first of my key points. All too often, a discussion about soft power which I must say is not a term I particularly like, is seen as a conflict with hard power, as if they are mutually exclusive approaches that a nation might use in foreign affairs. They are not, however, alternatives. They're not things if you can't do one, you can't do the other. No one is fool enough to think that sending Shakespeare to Moscow would have stopped a nuclear standoff, or now stopped the changing of the borders in Europe by force. But what it can do is to maintain links and relationships at times of great strain and build a sense of commonality, which is vital for the better times. The world has, of course, moved on since then, cycling through what Gideon Rachman has called the ages of transformation and optimism, when the opportunities for creative exchange have multiplied as the world becomes more connected. This seemed to have reached a peak of possibility with Rachman's age of optimism, when nothing seemed to stand in the way of open borders, win-win growth for all, and when even the global spread of McDonald's seemed to be a token of an interconnected, mutually dependent world, the virtuous ratchet effect of swirling innovation. But this all began to change in 2001. And then, with the financial difficulties, and as we enter Rachman's age of anxiety, all the threats, fractures and fears that it brings, what is the place of creative exchange? What is the place for creativity? In a world when interconnectivity is a source of anxiety and perhaps fear, where the problems of environmental degradation, disease, economic interdependence, political realignments all cross borders indifferent to the wishes and efforts of states and governments, one might well argue that there are more pressing issues than sharing nice ideas. I would argue, however, that it is more important now than ever. It is more important now precisely because of the transformed environment we find ourselves in. And that very interdependence means it is only through building international relationships of mutual interest and mutual value that we can create the capacity to manage the issues we confront. What are some of the elements of these changes? In our present-day environment, connections of value have moved decisively from elite to people to people. In the late 1970s, my predecessor visiting Manila saw the high point of his call on Imelda Marcos. In 2013, the highlight from my attendance at CHOGM in Colombo were visiting our day-long fair with the People-to-People Forum and the Youth Forum, and ensuring that young people from the UK were actively linked with fellows from across the Commonwealth. It is also a shift from the state to individuals. It's a modern truism that social media has transformed how people, especially the young, engage with each other. Anyone with a phone has become a broadcaster. Anyone with a Twitter account has become a journalist. I hope there are lots of journalists in here tonight. And that, in many parts of the world, these sources are much more likely to be trusted than any form of traditional media. And we've also seen a shift from centralisation to localisation, and perhaps also paradoxically from centralisation to internationalisation. The assertion of other identities in a more or less controlled or violent way, which are often subsumed under what seemed in the not-so-distant past to be secure and rigid state structures, which seemed inviolable. It is interesting that the Sykes-Picot Treaty, something which we have all forgotten until very, very recently, which is the figure on the top of that slide, and the extent to which people are refinding those old boundaries, and perhaps the terrible impact of ISIS on Syria and Iraq is in some senses a refinding of some of those old boundaries and those old senses of identity. It all adds up to the loss of state control and the amplification of other voices for good or ill. And a number of accelerators are pushing this even faster. The exponential growth in creativity, the non-state actors who now have the communication tools that were previously only available to states, the loss of trust in and belief in the intermediary. This all means an escalation in the power to create and the power to share. And also that this is all the more important. In Cloud Cultures, Charles Leadbeater highlighted this explosive growth of cultural expression. his equation ran more cultural heritage stored in digital form, plus more accessibility to more people, plus people better equipped with more tools to add creativity to the collection, equals exponential growth in mass cultural expression, and that equals cloud culture. It feels like a good summary of the power to share and create. And this changing set of environments leads to my second set of key issues. Cultural exchange has moved, and moved radically in the last 10 to 15 years, from an elite to a mass activity, from a state to state to a people to people, from an authority-based and authoritative to personal, anecdotal and episodic, and from centralised and institutional to both local and global at the same time. What does this all mean for the UK? What is this environment of hyperconnectivity, the rise of other voices, anxieties and shifting gravity of power mean for the golden thread of creativity and exchange? It means that it becomes more and more important in order for the UK to maintain its role, influence, prestige and prosperity in the world, and critically as the critical stimulus for our own creativity, by remaining a central node to global networks of knowledge and ideas. We can see the geopolitical rebalancing of the 21st century and the UK's place and dependence in this slide. There are many forecasts of the future, but virtually all of them has the UK with the potential of being a key player, whether that's the MOD's forecast of growth or Jim O'Neill's slightly more bullish that by 2050 the UK will be the EU's largest country by population, its largest economy and the only European economy in the top 10. But even more than those projections of growth, openness to exchange is fundamental to the UK now. The UK is exposed and knitted in the world more than almost any other country. Even in the crude measures of the UK's exports of goods and services as a proportion of GDP, the UK is second only to Germany in major countries as exposed to the rest of the world. And we can see this link even more when we look at the creative industries. According to government figures, the UK's creative industries are now worth £71.4 billion per year to the UK economy, with growth of almost 10% in 2012,